They said Tudor wives lost their marriages because they were difficult. No one mentioned the mistress who won by saying nothing. Beneath every lowered gaze was a quiet blade, slipping between reputation and desire. Behind each gentle silence lay a strategy sharper than truth itself. You may think you know how love and power moved through those halls, but the shadows tell a different story. Tonight, you will walk with me into a world where silence decides who survives. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into the private rooms of a Tudor household, it would become clear that obedience was never just a virtue. It lived in gestures, in lowered eyes. In the careful way a woman folded her hands when a man entered the room. It seemed gentle, harmless, and modest. But beneath the surface, obedience held a weight that shaped reputations, marriages, and the fragile balance of influence inside grand houses. What looked like meekness often carried intentions that no one dared to speak aloud. To understand how this worked, one must first see how mistresses moved through these spaces. They were expected to be pleasant, soft-spoken, and undemanding. Their presence was meant to soothe, not disrupt. And because they entered the man's life without legal ties or obligations, they carried no burden except to please. Their smiles were small, their words chosen sparingly, and their silences perfectly timed. Every gesture seemed effortless, though none of it was accidental. The Tudor wife lived in a different world entirely. Her role was defined by responsibility, a household to manage, alliances to maintain, heirs to produce, and a reputation to protect. Her voice mattered because her position demanded it. When she spoke firmly, it was interpreted as sharpness. When she questioned decisions, it was labeled discontent. When she defended herself, it became defiance. In a life filled with duties and scrutiny, silence was rarely an option. The mistress, however, could choose silence freely. A quiet nod, a gentle sigh, or a downcast gaze allowed her to signal understanding without risking accusation. Men mistook this for patience. They mistook compliance for kindness. And the less she spoke, the more virtuous she appeared in comparison to the wife, who had no choice but to raise her voice when reality required it. Silence was not passive. It was an image polished to perfection. This contrast did not need words to take shape. Servants noticed it first. How the mistress never interrupted. How she never contradicted her lover. How she floated through rooms as if untouched by frustration. Their whispers travelled, forming unspoken comparisons. A wife could not prevent these judgments. Her responsibilities ensured she was always visible. And visibility always carried the risk of appearing difficult. Inside these walls, obedience became a weapon sharpened by expectation. The mistress never had to show anger. She only had to appear calm. She never had to argue. She only had to watch the wife argue. She never had to defend her position. She only had to stay quiet while the wife defended hers. Each silence nudged the scale. Each nod made the wife look harsher. Each downturned gaze made the wife's frustration look unreasonable. Men absorbed these impressions quickly. They valued comfort far more than truth. A silent woman seemed easier to love than one who asked for fairness. A quiet presence felt more peaceful than a voice that spoke of responsibilities and grievances. The wife, who faced the brunt of daily work and constant judgment, became the source of tension. The mistress, untouched by duty, became the symbol of gentleness. Obedience, therefore, transformed into a mirror. Whatever the wife expressed, anger, exhaustion, or suspicion was reflected as fault. The mistress did not need to speak poorly of her. She only needed to remain patient. Her silence allowed men to imagine her as everything the wife was not. And in their minds, imagination mattered more than reality. The cruelty of this dynamic lay in its subtlety. No accusations were spoken. No conflict erupted openly. The mistress did not compete through argument, but through absence. She avoided confrontation entirely, letting her wife carry the burden of every difficult conversation. Over time, this shaped a narrative that favored the woman who said the least and punished the woman forced to speak the most. It was an unfair contest, one defined not by truth but by perception. Silence also protected the mistress. By refusing to voice complaints, she avoided creating evidence that could be held against her. By speaking softly or not at all, she preserved an image of purity that could not be disproven. In a society eager to criticize women, the safest position was to offer nothing that could be twisted. And so silence became a shield as much as it was a strategy. To the wife, this created a trap with no visible edges. She could not match the mistress's gentle quietness because her life did not allow it. She could not withdraw from responsibilities that demanded her voice. Every decision she made, every objection she raised, every attempt to restore balance only reinforced the contrast. Her words, spoken out of necessity, became evidence of her supposed flaws. Meanwhile, the mistress's silence grew more powerful with each exchange. What made obedience so effective was how natural it appeared. No one saw it as manipulation. No one questioned its convenience. It aligned perfectly with the expectations placed on Tudor women. The more silent a woman was, the more praise she earned. And so obedience became the language through which influence quietly flowed. Unspoken but deeply felt. To look back on these dynamics now is to see how fragile status could be, even for those legally protected. Silence shifted affection. Silence shaped judgment. Silence created an imbalance without raising a single voice. It was a weapon precisely because no one believed it was one. In a world where speech was dangerous for women, silence became a tool far more powerful than words. The mistress learned to use it with precision, allowing perception to work in her favor. And the wife discovered too late that obedience, once praised as virtue, could dismantle her standing without making a sound. Obedience shaped itself into an influence that required no accusation and left no trace. As this quiet pattern settled deeper into domestic life, the expectations placed on wives grew heavier and more unforgiving. What emerged next was a set of feminine ideals that tightened around them with a force they could neither refuse nor escape. A Tudor wife lived inside a set of expectations that hardened around her long before she understood their weight. She was meant to produce heirs, preserve alliances, and maintain a household whose reputation reflected directly on her. Every task rested on her shoulders, and every mistake was counted against her. Nothing about her role allowed softness or hesitation. From the moment she stepped into marriage, she became responsible for a standard of femininity that asked her to be patient, composed, and endlessly accommodating. Her duties stretched into every corner of daily life. She oversaw servants, meals, finance, and children. Yet she was expected to perform these responsibilities without complaint. The slightest sign of frustration could be turned into a flaw. If she spoke sharply, it was said she lacked grace. If she questioned her husband's decisions, it became evidence of disrespect. Even simple exhaustion could be misread as ingratitude. The work was constant, and so was the scrutiny. Silence, however, was not a luxury she possessed. A household required direction. Children required guidance. Servants required discipline. Every decision she made demanded words, and every word risked judgment. Her voice, essential to her duties, also became the easiest way to paint her as difficult. The more she managed, the more she could be criticized for the tone or timing of her speech. Her authority was expected, but her assertiveness was resented. The mistress faced none of this. She carried no lineage, no estate, no public reputation to protect. Her presence was shaped entirely by choice, not duty. She appeared in moments of comfort and withdrew when tension rose. Her silence, framed as femininity, was admired precisely because it cost her nothing. She had no household to run, no alliances to uphold, no aging parents to appease, no children to raise. Her stillness was not patience, it was freedom. Men rarely understood how uneven this comparison was. They felt the wife's words as pressure and the mistress's silence as gentleness. They noticed the wife's corrections, but ignored the countless decisions that forced her to speak at all. They valued quiet more than competence, calm more than honesty. A wife's realism was unwelcome. A mistress's softness felt like relief. These standards were reinforced everywhere. Priests preached obedience. Mothers taught their daughters reserve. Chronicles praised women who endured suffering without protest. Femininity was tied to silence, but only for those who could survive under its weight. The wife was judged harshly when she failed to embody patience. Even though her life demanded constant speech, the mistress earned admiration for stillness, even though she risked nothing by offering it. This contradiction shaped the emotional landscape of Tudor marriages. The wife struggled to balance authority with expectation. She tried to protect her children, to manage the estate, and maintain dignity while being labelled demanding for the same actions required of her. The mistress, untouched by responsibility, became the embodiment of every ideal the wife was told to achieve but could never sustain. It was a comparison she could not win. The burden deepened in public life. When the wife walked through markets, attended church, or hosted guests, she represented her husband's standing. Her clothing, posture, and speech were assessed by everyone who saw her. Any misstep, too stern, too sharp, too emotional, became fodder for rumour. She lived inside a pressure that taught her to carry herself carefully, even when exhausted, even when afraid. Meanwhile, the mistress could remain invisible whenever she wished. Her influence operated quietly, behind closed doors, where no one measured her behaviour against rigid rules. She was praised for traits the wife was punished for lacking: softness, serenity, and silence. Though both women existed within the same household structure, only one was allowed to be effortless. To the wife, this disparity felt like a constant erosion. She understood that every correction, every reminder, every necessary command made her appear less gentle. She knew that fulfilling her obligations made her seem harsher than the woman who had none. And she recognized, often too late, that the standard she was told to pursue was designed to undermine her. Femininity in Tudor society was less a virtue than a constraint. It asked women to be accommodating even when burdened, patient even when wronged, silent even when responsibilities made silence impossible. The wife's failure to embody an ideal she could never realistically maintain became evidence of her supposed inadequacy. The mistress's effortless compliance, untested by duty, became the false benchmark by which wives were measured. Over time, this belief shaped how households interpreted conflict. If the wife raised concerns, her tone overshadowed her reasons. If the mistress remained quiet, her silence suggested understanding. The contrast created a story without words, one woman too loud, one woman perfectly calm. Both narratives were untrue, yet both carried consequences. The wife remained trapped in this framework, judged not by her competence, but by how well she mimicked a version of femininity that ignored her reality. And with every passing day, the pressure tightened around her. leaving her increasingly vulnerable to comparison she never agreed to and could never escape. The expectations placed on her acted like a tightening loop, turning duty into fault. The contrast between her necessary voice and another woman's chosen silence made judgment feel effortless. And beneath these standards lay a tension that would soon harden into something far more punishing than a simple difference in temperament. A Tudor household often appeared orderly from the outside, but inside its walls, the imbalance between wife and mistress settled into daily life with quiet certainty. The wife stood in the center of that structure, whether she wished to or not. She hosted guests, managed servants, appeared beside her husband at church, and represented the family during gatherings. Her presence was required, and because it was required, it was constantly watched. Every greeting she offered, every correction she made, every hesitation in her voice became a detail that others weighed and repeated. Public expectation followed her like a shadow. She had to appear composed even when matters of the household strained her patience. She had to show warmth even when she carried the exhaustion of duties no one acknowledged. If she looked stern, it was said she lacked softness. If she looked weary, it became a rumor about failing health. And if she spoke firmly, it was interpreted as a lack of grace. Visibility demanded perfection, but perfection was impossible. The mistress existed under no such burden. She could vanish for days, withdraw into quiet corners, or step lightly into a room only when the atmosphere favored her. Her presence was optional, and an optional presence is always easier to idealize. When she appeared, it was at moments carefully chosen. Moments when she could seem gentle, patient, or comforting. She entered scenes already softened by timing. She was not required to show responsibility, only pleasantness. This contrast shaped perception long before anyone acknowledged it. Guests encountered the wife during formal events, where duty sharpened her words and posture. They encountered the mistress, if at all, during private moments, crafted to flatter her image. One woman was displayed, the other was curated, and curated things always appear more appealing. Inside the home, servants reinforced this imbalance without meaning to. They watched the wife issue orders, correct mistakes, and question expenses. It was part of her role to speak, to direct, to manage. They watched the mistress move quietly, offering no orders, causing no disruption, creating no conflict. The difference settled into their observations. One woman seemed demanding because she was required to be. The other seemed calm because nothing was asked of her. Men absorbed these impressions even more easily. Their encounters with their wives were shaped by necessity. Discussions about finances, children, alliance, and endless responsibilities. Their encounters with the mistress were shaped by escape. Moments carved out of the day when they sought relief from pressure. The wife represented reality. The mistress represented interruption. No comparison could ever be fair. Inside the same house, the two women lived parallel lives defined by unequal rules. The wife walked through rooms where her competence was measured with scrutiny. The mistress walked through rooms where her silence was interpreted as sweetness. Even the walls seemed to protect one woman while exposing the other. The inequality extended to judgment. If the wife displayed irritation after hours of managing a household, it became a flaw in her temperament. If the mistress remained quiet, it was praised as understanding. If the wife corrected a mistake, she seemed harsh. If the mistress avoided correction altogether, she seemed kind. The same actions were not allowed to hold the same meaning. This dynamic created an invisible pressure around the wife. She knew that her every word shaped how she would be perceived. She knew that her presence could be misinterpreted the moment she failed to meet impossible expectations. She also knew that the mistress, free from obligation, would always appear softer in comparison. It was not that the mistress acted better, only that she acted less. And doing less was easier to idealize. The home became a stage where both women were evaluated, but only one of them was performing the entire time. The wife filled the hours with duties. The mistress filled moments with curated calm. The wife existed under obligation. The mistress existed under choice. And choices, unlike duties, can be arranged to appear perfect. In the end, what mattered was not behavior, but perception. The wife could work tirelessly and still be judged for a single sharp word. The mistress could remain nearly absent and still be praised as gentle. Unequal roles crafted unequal impressions, and unequal impressions shaped the quiet resentments that grew within Tudor households. This imbalance did not need confrontation to become harmful. It worked through small moments. Eye contact, pause, tones, and absences. Over time, these moments were collected into a narrative that placed the wife at a disadvantage for simply doing what her role required. The household became a place where responsibility turned into vulnerability. The contrast between constant visibility and selective presence hardened into quiet judgment, and beneath this arrangement formed a tension that would soon reshape how affection and authority shifted inside these walls. Quiet gestures held surprising influence within Tudor households, especially when employed by a mistress who understood how perception shaped everything. A lowered gaze, a softened breath, or a small bow could shift the meaning of an entire conversation without a single word being spoken. These subtle movements cast her in a light that seemed gentle, self-contained, and endlessly patient. And because patience was prized above clarity, she gained sympathy long before anyone noticed the implications. The wife often entered these moments already burdened by responsibility. Her day might have been filled with disputes among servants, concerns about finances, or worries over her children's health. By the time she met her husband or crossed paths with the mistress, exhaustion had already thinned her composure. A sharp tone or brief frown could escape, not from malice, but from a life filled with demands. Yet these traces of strain became evidence against her. The mistress did not need to challenge her directly. Instead, she allowed the wife's tension to fill the space while she stepped back in silence. A faint lowering of her head made the wife's exasperation seem harsh. A soft retreat into the background made the wife's questions sound accusatory. Moments crafted in quietness softened the mistress's presence while sharpening the wife's, and once such impressions settled, they grew roots that were hard to pull out. Men responded quickly to these contrasts. Their meetings with the wife often revolved around obligations, unpaid rents, misbehaving children, strained alliances, or news from neighboring estates. These conversations carried weight, and weight rarely came without friction. When these same men encountered the mistress, the atmosphere changed entirely. She presented a space without pressure, without expectation, without argument. Her silence felt like calm after noise, even if the noise had been necessary. As these patterns repeated, irritation from the wife began to appear unreasonable. A mistress who bowed her head during a tense moment created an illusion of innocence. A wife who expressed suspicion or fatigue suddenly seemed jealous, unstable, or overly emotional. The comparison was not fair, yet it formed naturally, shaped by timing rather than truth. Among servants, the contrast spread even faster. They witnessed the wife issuing commands, correcting mistakes, and confronting disobedience. These tasks were part of her position, but they exposed her to constant judgment. They saw the mistress pass through corridors quietly, rarely interrupting the rhythm of the household, because she required nothing from them. She seemed easier to respect. Over time, whispers grew, one woman demanding, one woman gentle. Neither description was accurate. Yet both took hold. Guests added another layer to this imbalance. At gatherings, the wife appeared under the strain of formality. She managed seating arrangements, greeted visitors, and ensured the evening ran smoothly. Under such pressure, composure was difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, if the mistress appeared briefly, offering a soft smile, a graceful tilt of the head, her small gestures seemed more charming than the wife's practiced courtesy. Guests remembered the ease, not the effort. In private chambers, the imbalance persisted. A husband returning from a day of tension might find the mistress sitting quietly, offering no demands. Her silence allowed him to relax, convincing him that stillness was the same as kindness. When his wife later confronted him about a broken promise, a questionable absence, or a suspicious exchange, her frustration seemed exaggerated next to the lingering calm he associated with the mistress. He did not weigh responsibility, he compared feelings. The cruelty lay in how easily these impressions hardened. A single bow at the right moment might make a wife look irrational. A single soft look might make the wife's justified anger seem excessive. The mistress did not need to manipulate actively. She only needed to avoid reacting. Every quiet gesture she offered created contrast, and contrast became judgment. Over time, the wife found herself trapped. Her attempts to navigate a difficult marriage, manage a large household, and maintain her dignity only made her appear more tense. Her anger, when it surfaced, became the very thing used to discredit her. The mistress's silence, shaped carefully and deployed strategically, became a weapon that left no wound but caused serious damage. This dynamic persisted because it aligned with social expectations. Women were praised for calmness, punished for strong emotion, admired for patience, and criticized for speaking too much. Men saw themselves as victims of conflict rather than contributors to it. The mistress's quietness allowed them to believe that the wife's voice, not their own behavior, caused disharmony. In such an environment, a bow of the head carried more power than a spoken truth. A sigh placed at the right moment had the force of an accusation without revealing intention. A step back could convince observers that the wife's anger was unfounded. The mistress did not need to speak to win sympathy. Silence did the work for her. The household turned small gestures into silent verdicts that cut deeper than any argument. The contrast between calm retreat and necessary confrontation created judgments that looked effortless. What emerged beneath these shifting impressions was a quieter form of influence that pressed directly against a husband's sense of guilt and desire. Manipulation inside a Tudor household rarely arrived through accusation. It often slipped in quietly, shaped by the subtle restraint of a mistress who understood the emotional weaknesses of men far better than their wives ever could. She did not blame. She did not question. She did not point out broken promises or shifting loyalties. Instead, she offered silence where others offered truth, softness where others offered realism. This gentleness became a sanctuary for men who wished to escape the weight of their own decisions. The husband often came to her with frustrations already formed long before he crossed her doorway. Work, status, obligations, political tension. Each pulled at him in ways he refused to acknowledge openly. When he found the mistress waiting, calm and receptive, he mistook the absence of challenge for understanding. Her silence allowed him to believe he was being heard, even when no word was exchanged. In reality, she was not listening so much as allowing him to dissolve his guilt into her stillness. The wife, however, had no place for such illusions. She faced the practical consequences of every choice her husband made. When money ran short, she managed it. When alliances shifted, she soothed tensions. When servants disobeyed, she corrected them. Her concerns were tied to the household's survival, not to emotional comfort. But practicality can sound harsh next to softness, and men often preferred the version of themselves reflected in the mistress's eyes. The mistress understood this preference well. She knew that men feared confrontation, even when they deserved it. She knew they resented being reminded of their failures, even when those reminders were necessary. By refusing to demand anything from him, she created a space where he felt virtuous simply because he was not being challenged. It was effortless influence, built on the illusion that she accepted him completely. When the wife raised legitimate concerns about finances, loyalty, behavior, or propriety, her words were measured against the mistress's silence. Practical requests became criticism. Necessary warnings became nagging. Reasonable boundaries became evidence of her difficult nature. The more she spoke, the more the mistress appeared patient. By contrast, and because the husband preferred comfort over clarity, he leaned toward the quieter presence, even when it misled him. This dynamic deepened each time the mistress withheld judgment. A man who expected reprimand, but received gentleness, instead felt gratitude, even affection. He convinced himself she understood him in ways his wife did not. He mistook her lack of demands for emotional depth, failing to see that she simply held no responsibility. The wife's realism became a burden. The mistress's passivity became relief. Inside the household, this relief grew into a pattern. When conflict arose, the husband retreated to the mistress's quietness rather than facing the wife's justified frustration. She created no resistance, and he interpreted this as forgiveness. She allowed him to escape accountability, and he interpreted this as loyalty. She offered no pressure, and he interpreted this as love. The absence of emotional labor became a deliberate performance that rewarded him for avoiding responsibility. Men rarely realized how expertly this dynamic was shaped. The mistress used silence not only to comfort, but to position herself as the safer emotional choice. She let the wife take on the ungrateful tasks, pointing out faults, protecting the household, and demanding basic respect. She offered nothing but calm. Knowing calm alone could make a man feel protected. The more pressure the wife faced, the more appealing the mistress became. Eventually, the wife's attempts to address real issues made her appear unreasonable. She questioned the husband's decisions because she had to. She spoke about boundaries because no one else would. She noticed changes in behavior because her survival, and that of her children, depended on it. Yet these actions, necessary as they were, became the very reasons he resented her. The mistress's softness turned his guilt outward, convincing him that the discomfort he felt came from his wife rather than from his own conscience. What made this manipulation particularly cruel was its subtlety. The mistress rarely needed to suggest anything openly. She never spoke ill of the wife directly. Instead, she allowed the husband to reach conclusions that benefited her, conclusions he believed were his own. She guided him not with argument but with absence. Absence of blame, absence of expectation, absence of truth. The emptiness created space for him to imagine virtues she never possessed. The wife, meanwhile, found herself trapped in a role that demanded honesty, yet punished her for offering it. She could not soothe him with silence, because silence would not protect the household. She could not ignore his failings, because they affected every corner of their lives. She could not retreat from conflict, because conflict was forced upon her by necessity. And each time she acted responsibly, she appeared harsher beside the mistress's crafted stillness. At its core, this manipulation thrived because guilt seeks the gentlest refuge. A man confronted by truth might feel shame, but a man met with silence feels comfort. The mistress learned to offer that comfort at precisely the moments when truth might have changed him. She ensured that guilt turned not inward, where it belonged, but outward, toward the wife, who bore the consequences of his avoidance. The emotional contrast twisted responsibility into resentment, leaving the wife blamed for problems she did not create. The quiet refuge offered by the mistress encouraged a man to drift away from truth whenever truth became inconvenient. Beneath that gentle manipulation, A quieter shift was beginning to alter how desire moved within the household. Silence inside a Tudor household often carried more meaning than speech, especially when used by a mistress who understood how desire formed in the minds of men. Stillness softened her edges, allowing her to appear gentle without proving gentleness. Quietness surrounded her like a veil, shaping her into a figure of calm that men longed to approach. To them, this absence of resistance seemed like femininity at its purest. Pliant, patient, unthreatening, they mistook silence for softness, and softness for affection. This perception grew stronger with each carefully timed pause. When a man spoke about his frustrations or ambitions, the mistress rarely interrupted. She let his voice fill the space while offering nothing that might challenge him. Her silence became a canvas on which he painted his preferred version of her. Whatever qualities he wanted: loyalty, admiration, innocence, seemed to shine through simply because she did not deny them. The less she revealed, the more he imagined. The wife, however, had no such luxury. Her days overflowed with responsibilities that required action, direction, and explanation. Silence in her position was impossible. Her authority over the household demanded constant interaction, assigning tasks, questioning decisions, correcting mistakes. These acts shaped survival, not seduction. Yet men interpreted this necessity as harshness, contrasting it with the mistress's effortless quiet. The difference lay not in temperament, but in circumstance, though few recognized it. Within this imbalance, silence became a form of invitation. A mistress who lowered her eyes or remained still during tense conversations allowed the man to believe she understood him intuitively. He interpreted her quietness as agreement, even when no agreement existed. He saw her stillness as emotional depth, forgetting that true depth requires vulnerability rather than concealment. In truth, she offered nothing but space, and space alone was enough to make him long for her presence. Desire fed on imagination more easily than reality. The mistress's silence allowed fantasies to grow unchecked. A wife, bound to daily life, revealed too much to be reimagined. The mistress, revealing almost nothing, became whatever the man needed her to be in the moment. She learned to cultivate this ambiguity, offering glimpses but never clarity. Her quiet demeanor disguised intention, creating a seductive distance that felt safe yet mysterious. In private encounters, silence did its most subtle work. A man might speak about his doubts, his frustrations, or his disappointments, waiting for emotional reaction. When the mistress responded with nothing more than a soft breath or a lowered gaze, he felt validated rather than challenged. He believed she accepted him entirely. He believed she recognized his worth. Her refusal to oppose him became a form of flattery, far more powerful than any spoken compliment. For the wife, this created an invisible threat. She faced the consequences of his choices and the realities he tried to escape. When she attempted to reason with him about finances, infidelity, or household matters, her questions sounded like opposition compared to the mistress's silence. Her attempts to hold him accountable felt like accusations. Logic could not compete with fantasy, and duty could not compete with stillness. The more she tried to address real problems, the more he drifted toward the woman who avoided them. Servants, observing the contrast, reinforced the illusion through whispers. They saw the wife's necessary commands and the mistress's lack of demands. One woman appeared commanding, the other appeared gentle. They saw the wife's moments of strain, but not the weight she carried. They saw the mistress's quietness, but not the emptiness behind it. Perception hardened into rumor, and rumor hardened into belief. Over time, silence created emotional momentum. A man convinced himself that the mistress understood him better than the wife. even though she knew little of his burdens. He convinced himself her quietness signaled devotion, not calculation. He convinced himself she gave him peace, forgetting that peace created by avoidance cannot last. Desire thrives on illusion, and silence provided that illusion perfectly. The mistress, aware of this dynamic, I've learned to maintain it carefully. She did not reveal too much. She did not press for certainty. She let the man fill the gaps with his imagination, because imagination offered more than reality ever could. By withholding resistance, she created the illusion of harmony. By withholding opinion, she created the illusion of agreement. By withholding the truth, she created the illusion of intimacy. The wife, bound to honesty and responsibility, could not compete with illusions. Her realism, essential to the household, became the very thing that set her apart from the quiet figure who demanded nothing from the man emotionally or practically. Silence, in this context, was not merely absence. It was a weapon disguised as grace. This quiet allure reshaped desire, rewarding the woman who revealed least. The slow drift toward her silence deepened each time. Responsibility felt heavier than fantasy. And within that shifting current waited a new distortion, one that would turn the wife's every word into evidence of fault. Complaints inside a Tudor marriage rarely stayed in their original form. A wife could speak with clarity, caution, or necessity, yet her words were often transformed into something sharper in the ears of those who listened. When she pointed out an injustice, she was told she was sensitive. When she requested fairness, she was told she was demanding. When she expressed hurt, she was told she was jealous. Her voice, required for the survival of the household, became the very thing used to discredit her. Much of this distortion came from contrast. The mistress, who held no responsibility and faced no consequences, appeared endlessly patient. She did not speak of unfairness because she was untouched by it. She did not warn of danger because she faced none. She did not object because nothing in her life required correction. Her silence, shaped by convenience, looked calm. The wife's speech, shaped by necessity, looked like unrest. In the eyes of others, one sounded like trouble, the other like peace. This perception hardened quickly. Servants noticed it first, though they rarely spoke of it directly. They heard the wife correcting careless work, addressing shortages, or questioning unexplained expenses. These tasks required authority, and authority required words. Yet each correction made her seem harsher than the mistress, who offered no direction at all. The wife's visible labour became evidence of an unpleasant temperament, while the mistress's absence from responsibility became evidence of sweetness. Men, too, absorbed this imbalance. When the wife spoke of unfair treatment or suspected betrayal, her tone carried the weight of accumulated frustration. He heard sharpness where she offered truth. He heard an accusation where she offered clarity. He heard attitude where she offered a warning. A mistress who remained silent in the same moment appeared understanding simply because she did not challenge him. Silence again functioned as a comparison, shaping perception more effectively than logic. Over time, this created a dangerous pattern. The more the wife tried to address problems, the more she was blamed for causing them. She spoke because she saw clearly, but clarity was unwelcome in a world that preferred illusions. She questioned because questions kept the household stable, but stability meant little compared to comfort. Her every attempt to protect what was hers made her seem unreasonable, while the mistress's refusal to engage made her seem virtuous. This imbalance extended beyond emotion into social expectation. Tudor society rewarded women who endured quietly. A woman who accepted misfortune without protest was praised as patient. A woman who defended herself was labelled troublesome. The wife lived under this scrutiny daily, and each time she raised her voice to address real harm, People around her interpreted her concern as attitude. They did not weigh her circumstances, they weighed her tone. Within the household, this misinterpretation became its own quiet punishment. Conversations that needed honesty became dangerous. Requests for fairness turned into opportunities for criticism. When the wife confronted her husband about the mistress's presence, she sounded jealous. When she confronted him about broken promises, she sounded ungrateful. When she spoke of hurt, she sounded unreasonable. The mistress did not need to defend herself. The wife's own words did that work for her. The mistress understood this dynamic, even if she never acknowledged it openly. She presented herself as tolerant, kind, endlessly considerate. Behaviors made easy by her lack of responsibility. Her silence became a shield that protected her from scrutiny, while the wife's necessary speech exposed her to constant judgment. The mistress did not need to win arguments, she only needed to allow the wife to speak, knowing that speaking would be turned against her. The cruelty of this pattern lay in its simplicity. Speech, once a tool of connection, became evidence of fault. A wife who expressed pain became emotional. A wife who set boundaries became controlling. A wife who demanded respect became difficult. Her voice, shaped by obligation, was reinterpreted by others through the lens of bias. The mistress's silence created no friction, so it was praised. The wife's honesty created discomfort, so it was condemned. This distortion also eroded the wife's sense of self. When every complaint became overreaction, she began to question her own judgment. When every truth was dismissed as suspicion, she began to doubt her own clarity. When every plea for fairness was labeled as nagging, she began to silence herself. In this silence, resentment grew, not because she was naturally bitter, but because speaking made her vulnerable, while staying quiet made her invisible. Yet silence offered her no protection. The mistress's quietness was interpreted as virtue. The wife's quietness was interpreted as retreat. She could not win through words or through silence, because the rules were designed to favor the woman who carried no duties and risked no judgment. The moment she opened her mouth, she confirmed the bias placed upon her. The moment she closed it, she abandoned her only means of defense. Perception, once formed, proved almost impossible to reverse. A single complaint from the wife could outweigh months of patience. A single polite gesture from the mistress could overshadow weeks of manipulation. The imbalance continued because everyone accepted the surface as truth. In this way, a wife's voice, meant to speak for her home and her dignity, was stripped of its value, leaving her isolated inside the very household she maintained. This quiet rebranding of truth turned her necessary words into convenient flaws. The ease with which others misread her concern deepened the distance between responsibility and perception. Deep within this shifting judgment, another imbalance began to take root, one that relied not on what she said, but on how the mistress simply appeared. Presence inside a Tudor household often carried more weight than words, especially when it belonged to a mistress who understood precisely when to step forward and when to disappear. She did not need arguments or accusations. A simple entrance at the right moment, a soft lowering of her gaze, or a brief pause before retreating could change the direction of a conversation. Her presence alone shaped interpretation, turning neutral events into evidence against the wife without ever revealing intention. Timing, for her, was everything. She appeared when tensions ran high, letting her quietness highlight the wife's frustration. She stood near doorways just long enough for observers to notice her composure. She positioned herself beside the husband during peaceful moments, creating the illusion that harmony followed her. None of these actions was overt, yet each one carved a deeper contrast between her controlled stillness and the wife's visible strain. The wife, already burdened by duties and expectations, often lacked the luxury of carefully crafted entrances. She arrived when needed, not when convenient. Her clothing bore the signs of a day spent managing servants or calming children. Her voice carried the fatigue of countless decisions. When she entered a room filled with murmurs or suspicion, she faced an audience whose impressions had already shifted before she spoke a word. Observers rarely questioned why the mistress seemed calm. They never saw her exhaustion because she did not participate in the household's labor. They never heard her raise her tone because she avoided the moments that required authority. When placed beside the wife, her stillness seemed admirable, her gentleness natural. It was easy for onlookers to imagine her as the kinder woman, even when they knew nothing of her true character. This contrast sharpened most cruelly during moments of conflict. If the wife confronted the husband about infidelity, broken promises, or disrespect, the mistress only needed to appear at the edge of the conversation. A lowered head made her seem wounded. A step back made her seem innocent. A quiet breath made her seem fragile. These gestures redirected sympathy without communicating anything at all. Meanwhile, the wife's justified anger appeared uncontrolled, aggressive, or jealous simply because emotion stood beside silence. Over time, the wife learned that her presence in these moments only made matters worse. Any attempt to defend herself risked being interpreted as hostility. Any effort to explain her concerns risked being labeled dramatic. Silence offered no safety, and speech offered no justice. The mistress's carefully curated stillness shaped the room long before the wife opened her mouth. The household itself played a role in maintaining this imbalance. Servants whispered about what they saw, repeating fragments of gestures and glances. A single moment, a bowed head, a gentle sigh, a soft smile, turned into a story about the mistress's supposed kindness or innocence. Meanwhile, the wife's attempts to maintain order became rumors of cruelty or resentment. The wife fought against narratives formed not by truth but by timing. The husband, too, became susceptible to these impressions. He witnessed his wife only during moments of responsibility, stress, or confrontation. He encountered the mistress mostly during quiet, curated scenes designed to soothe him. When conflict arose, he compared these two images unconsciously. He saw one woman struggling under the weight of real duty, and another woman offering harmony without effort. Desire drifted naturally toward the easier presence. The cruelty of this dynamic was that the mistress did not need to intend harm. Her silence created meaning without her participation. By appearing at strategic moments, she allowed the wife's words and emotions to become self-incriminating. The wife's reputation suffered because others filled in the mistress's silence with assumptions. And those assumptions always favored the woman who said the least. In time, the wife felt the imbalance tightening around her like an invisible rope. She found herself explaining actions she never took, defending intentions she never held, and justifying entirely reasonable reactions. Her husband questioned her tone rather than his own behavior. Servants judged her frustrations while praising the mistress's serenity. Visitors whispered about her temper while admiring the mistress's quiet grace. She was held accountable not only for her actions, but also for the illusions crafted by someone else's silence. Every gesture from the mistress became a silent verdict. Every glance downward suggested injury. Every subtle withdrawal framed the wife as the aggressor. The wife understood this too late. By the time she recognized the pattern, audiences within the household had already decided who was gentle and who was difficult. Presence, when wielded with precision, became a form of manipulation stronger than speech. The mistress did not need to argue, accuse, or defend. She only needed to be there. Soft, small, and perfectly timed. The wife required to live truthfully. I had no such control. Her reality worked against her, while the mistress's silence shaped perception effortlessly. This quiet choreography reshaped how the household interpreted every interaction. The contrast between deliberate softness and necessary emotion hardened into judgments that ignored truth entirely. Hidden within this shifting balance lay a deeper vulnerability, the unequal freedom each woman possessed to make mistakes. Public perception in Tudor England carried a weight that settled most heavily on the wife, whose reputation was tied to every movement she made. Her marriage was not only a bond but a public contract, a reflection of her husband's status, her family's honour, and the expectations of an entire community, because she represented stability, lineage, and propriety. She walked through the world under constant observation. A single misstep, a sharp tone, a delayed smile, an expression of fatigue could transform into a rumour. Reputation followed her like an unyielding shadow. This scrutiny extended into every part of her life. At church, she was expected to kneel gracefully and greet others with warmth. At markets, her conduct demonstrated the household's dignity. At gatherings, she carried herself with the composure of someone who never faltered. Nothing about her existence allowed spontaneity. Each gesture had meaning, each silence had implication. A moment of visible emotion could become the subject of whispered judgment before she even returned home. The mistress, by contrast, existed outside this public contract. She belonged to the margins, noticed privately, discussed quietly, and acknowledged only in spaces where discretion was accepted. Because her presence lacked official standing, she faced no expectations. No one demanded perfection from her. No one judged her posture in church or her tone in the marketplace. She simply did not exist in the public eye unless she wished to. This absence of scrutiny became a powerful advantage. While the wife was forced to maintain her composure under all circumstances, the mistress could make mistakes without consequence. She could display emotion, retreat into silence, or abandon propriety entirely, and outsiders would overlook it because she was not bound to represent anything. Her behaviour carried no public weight, and therefore no public risk. Inside the household, this imbalance grew sharper. The wife knew that any conflict reaching the ears of neighbours could stain her dignity. She understood that her conduct reflected not only on herself, but on the entire lineage she upheld. A raised voice might be interpreted as a lack of discipline. A moment of weakness could be portrayed as instability. Her actions were not merely personal, they were political. The mistress, however, faced none of this pressure. Her influence existed behind closed doors. If tensions arose, they stayed contained within private rooms. If rumours spread, they rarely touched her name directly. Her detachment from public scrutiny gave her the freedom the wife could never afford, the freedom to act without fear of social consequence. She could cultivate sympathy from her husband without risking judgment from the world outside. This difference in consequences shaped their emotional landscapes. The wife worried constantly about how her words might be interpreted, how her reactions might be retold, and how her presence might be misread. Her caution made her appear restrained, sometimes cold. Meanwhile, the mistress could appear open, warm, or vulnerable without fear of misinterpretation. Her emotional freedom made her seem more human, while the wife's guardedness was mistaken for severity. This contrast deepened whenever conflict emerged. A wife confronting her husband about infidelity risked being judged by those who heard of it. Her complaint could be retold as bitterness or jealousy. Her attempt to protect her marriage could be framed as an overreaction. She was punished socially for defending her position. The mistress, by remaining silent, avoided these dangers entirely. She never needed to justify herself publicly because the public never held expectations for her. Even within the same household, the imbalance shaped loyalty. Servants observed the wife's cautious behaviour, the careful control of her tone, the deliberate selection of words, and the rehearsed politeness. They rarely understood that this restraint was a form of protection. They saw the mistress's relaxed manner and mistook it for kindness, unaware that she carried no risk. Over time, Impressions hardened into quiet judgments. One woman tense, the other gentle. Men, too, were affected by these skewed perceptions. They saw their wives as stiff or overly concerned with propriety, forgetting that women were punished harshly for failing to uphold it. They interpreted the mistress's ease as evidence of sincerity rather than freedom. They misunderstood the weight carried by each woman, preferring the one who seemed lighter, simply because she bore no responsibility. The wife lived in a world that demanded perfection from her and indifference from everyone else. She could not afford to show humanity in public, yet she was blamed for appearing distant. She could not abandon her dignity, yet she was blamed for lacking warmth. Her public role became a trap. She could not escape it, and she could not win within it. The mistress, shielded from these expectations, moved through life unburdened by reputation. She could adapt, conceal, or reinvent herself without fear. Her detachment from public judgment made her nearly untouchable. In the quiet balance of influence, the wife found herself limited by consequences, while the mistress expanded freely in the spaces left unguarded. This division between public duty and private freedom deepened the emotional imbalance within the home. The wife, bound tightly by reputation, carried vulnerabilities the mistress never had to consider. Emerging from this contrast was a new danger: how silence itself could begin to dictate a man's comfort more effectively than truth. Silence has a way of settling into a room before anyone realizes its influence. In a Tudor household, that silence often belonged to the mistress, whose quiet presence created a calm that men interpreted as understanding. She offered no objections when he spoke of his frustrations, no challenges when he contradicted himself, and no reminders of promises he had forgotten. Her stillness made him feel unburdened, as if she absorbed tension simply by refusing to acknowledge it. This calm became addictive. The wife, meanwhile, carried the responsibility of speaking truth. She was expected to remind him of duties, confront his inconsistencies, and protect the structure of their home. Her honesty, offered out of necessity, became a source of discomfort for him. He heard pressure where she offered clarity. He heard demands where she offered balance. He heard conflict where she offered reality. Her intention was stability, but he interpreted it as strain. Over time, the contrast hardened into preference. The mistress's silence allowed him to imagine he was understood, even when she understood nothing at all. He projected gentleness onto her because she never interrupted his narrative. He believed she soothed him, not realizing he was soothing himself through her absence of resistance. Her quietness felt like acceptance, though it was mostly detachment. The wife's honesty, on the other hand, demanded his participation. She asked him to confront the consequences of his choices. She required him to acknowledge harm, repair trust, and take responsibility. These demands were not cruel. They were the foundation of a functioning marriage. But he experienced them as heaviness. He forgot that the ability to speak truth was a form of loyalty, not aggression. Men in this era were conditioned to avoid emotional labor. They believed their decisions deserved compliance, not evaluation. A wife who questioned them threatened their sense of authority. A mistress who remained quiet reinforced it. This dynamic rewarded the woman who risked nothing and punished the woman who risked everything. Silence became a tool that shaped a man's comfort in ways he never recognized consciously. Inside the home, this emotional imbalance deepened. When the wife attempted to discuss wrongdoing, he flinched at her tone rather than her message. When she expressed pain, he focused on his discomfort rather than its cause. When she sought resolution, he saw conflict instead. Her emotional clarity felt like an intrusion, while the mistress's detachment felt like refuge. He mistook avoidance for tenderness. The mistress understood this effect, even if she never articulated it. She learned that quiet sympathy invited him to relax into her presence. She did not need to offer solutions or insights. She only needed to remain soft around the edges, never pushing him toward accountability. Her silence shaped his emotions without requiring effort. And in return, he rewarded her with affection she had not earned. The wife, witnessing this shift, felt the consequences before he admitted them. She noticed how he softened at the mistress's name, how he defended her without hesitation, how he recoiled from honest conversations that once came naturally. She watched as her attempts to resolve tensions were dismissed as needless conflict. Her voice, once part of their shared life, became something he wished to escape. In this imbalance, silence transformed into power. The mistress wielded it not through intention but through structure. Society demanded nothing from her, so she could present herself as endlessly agreeable. The wife, bound by duty, could never choose silence without neglecting her responsibilities. Her truth became a burden he resented, while the mistress's emptiness became a space he filled with fantasies of peace. The tragedy of this dynamic lay in how easily silence masqueraded as love. He believed the mistress cherished him because she did not challenge him. He believed his wife cared less because she did. Emotional work went unnoticed, while emotional absence became romanticized. He mistook comfort for connection. As this misconception deepened, the wife's attempts to reclaim her place were met with resistance. The more she tried to repair the marriage, the more he withdrew. The more she explained, the less he listened. The more she spoke, the more he idealized the woman who stayed silent. Her efforts became evidence against her, while the mistress's passivity became proof of superior affection. Silence, in this context, shaped a man's emotions more effectively than truth ever could. It allowed him to maintain illusions. It shielded him from discomfort. It let him believe that harmony existed simply because no one named the problems he created. The mistress did not have to manipulate him actively. The structure of the world did the work on her behalf. This quiet imbalance transformed emotional comfort into a distorted measure of affection. The man drifted toward the woman who required nothing from him, forgetting the weight carried by the woman who spoke truth. Within this shift, another danger began to form. How easily a wife's rightful voice could be recast as fault itself. Argument in a Tudor household was never a balanced field. The wife entered it carrying the full weight of duty, truth, and the exhausting clarity that responsibility demands. She spoke because the situation required her to. She named what was broken, because refusing to do so would allow the fracture to spread. But each time she opened her mouth, she walked into a contest she could not win, because she was arguing not against words, but against silence. The mistress's silence acted like a mirror that distorted every sound the wife made. A raised concern from the wife sounded like an accusation. A plea for respect sounded like desperation. A reminder of past promises sounded like nagging. Meanwhile, the mistress expressed nothing. She did not defend herself. She did not deny wrongdoing. She did not weep or protest. Her stillness created the illusion of wounded innocence, the kind that requires no explanation. The wife's voice therefore became louder simply because it existed. This contrast created a cruel effect. The more truthful the wife was, the harsher she appeared. She spoke clearly, and clarity looked like aggression. She expressed pain, and pain looked like instability. She sought accountability, and accountability looked like hostility. In a room where one woman cried quietly without tears and the other tried to salvage a collapsing marriage, observers gravitated toward the one who made less noise. The husband, too, leaned toward silence. He felt attacked, not because the wife was unkind, but because she demanded that he face the consequences of his choices. Silence from the mistress allowed him to avoid guilt. Her quiet presence offered him an escape from the discomfort of reality. When he compared both women, one speaking out of necessity, one refusing to speak at all, he gravitated toward the easier option. He chose quiet over truth, even as the truth stood directly in front of him. This dynamic played out repeatedly in households across the era. A wife would gather her resolve to confront betrayal. Yet the moment she raised her voice, the mistress would lower her gaze, turning herself into a silent symbol of gentle suffering. Listeners read that stillness as dignity. They read the wife's urgency as chaos. The mistress did not need to win the argument. She only needed to refrain from joining it. The wife's frustration soon became part of the narrative against her. She had been wronged, but her reaction became the evidence used to blame her, even when she spoke calmly. Observers remembered the moments when her voice cracked or her breath quickened. Meanwhile, the mistress's silence scrubbed her of responsibility. No one recalled her provocations or manipulations because sound was easier to remember than quietness. Servants whispered among themselves, describing the wife as high-strung, temperamental, or overly emotional. They spoke admiringly of the mistress's composure, never questioning what allowed that composure to exist. They did not see the weight the wife carried. They saw only the surface. And surface impressions shaped loyalties far more effectively than truth. Over time, the wife found herself forced into impossible choices. If she stayed silent, problems festered. If she spoke, she was blamed. If she confronted her husband, she seemed ungrateful. If she confronted the mistress, she seemed jealous. Each path toward justice was framed as a flaw in her character. Meanwhile, the mistress's absence from the emotional work of the household allowed her silence to function as a weapon sharpened by expectation, not intention. The husband learned to interpret silence as gentleness. He believed the mistress understood him without question because she never questioned him. He mistook her lack of resistance for empathy. Her quietness soothed him because it allowed him to avoid the discomfort of reflection. The more the wife tried to clarify the truth, the more he retreated into the shadow of the mistress's mute sympathy. In this fractured space, arguments ceased to be about content and became entirely about tone. A single sigh from the wife could be exaggerated into a storm. A single bowed head from the mistress could be elevated into a saintly gesture. The imbalance became so large that the wife could not correct it. No matter how carefully she spoke, she was heard through a filter she did not create and could not remove. The tragedy lay in how predictable the outcome became. No matter how reasoned her argument, no matter how justified her anger, the wife appeared to be the disruptor. The mistress's silence, untouched by the responsibilities of marriage, became the acceptable emotional landscape. A man, exhausted by confrontation, reached not for the truth-teller, but for the one who made him feel innocent simply by refusing to speak. In such a world, truth lost its power. Silence became the language that shaped perception, controlled sympathy, and redefined guilt. The wife discovered that she could never win, not because she was wrong, but because she was the only one speaking. This tilted landscape turned honesty into noise and silence into virtue. The imbalance widened each time a man sought comfort in the very quietness that concealed complication. Within that widening gap waited another shift. How strategic silence could transform from defense into a weapon that shaped the future of the household. Some women in Tudor households learned early that silence could be shaped into something far more deliberate than patience. They recognized that a well-timed withdrawal, a softened breath, or a gaze lowered at the right moment could redirect an entire conversation without a single word. Silence, for them, was not absence. It was a strategy, cleaner than argument, safer than accusation, and far more effective than confrontation. They understood that a man's heart often traveled toward whatever demanded the least of him. These women did not seek victory in the traditional sense. They did not try to win debates, expose contradiction, or force a reckoning. Instead, they aimed for something quieter and far more enduring, a presence in the man's mind. By saying nothing, They allowed him to imagine them as gentle, patient, and endlessly understanding. They let him fill the gaps with fantasies of harmony. They became symbols rather than participants. And symbols, once established, are almost impossible to argue against. The wife, however, did not have the luxury of fighting symbol with symbol. She had to live in the world of reality. Servants to manage, finances to monitor, children to raise, alliance to protect. Her voice was needed, not optional. Every day brought new demands that required her to speak with authority, caution, or urgency, while the mistress could build influence through carefully crafted silence. The wife had to carve hers out of constant effort. This difference created a widening emotional divide. The mistress's silence made her seem soft, while the wife's necessary speech made her seem hard. The mistress appeared devoted simply because she avoided conflict, while the wife appeared difficult because she engaged with it. Men, conditioned to avoid emotional discomfort, interpreted these differences through the lens of convenience. The mistress became the place they rested. The wife became the place where they resisted. Strategic silence also offered the mistress a shield from consequences. By refusing to enter arguments, she avoided responsibility for their results. If the husband grew angry, she bowed her head. If the wife confronted her, she stepped back. If tensions rose, she let the noise swirl around her without ever responding. Her silence never betrayed her intentions. And because she revealed nothing, she risked nothing. The wife, by contrast, had no such shield. Every word she spoke could be used to evaluate her character, her loyalty, her temperament. A single moment of frustration could overshadow months of restraint. A single plea for fairness could be twisted into an accusation. Because she could not afford to step away from conflict, she became trapped inside it. The more she tried to be understood, the less understanding she received. Some mistresses understood this imbalance intuitively and used it with precision. They knew when to disappear, leaving the wife alone to confront the husband's moods. They knew when to reappear, allowing their silence to seem like comfort in contrast to the wife's strained attempts at diplomacy. They knew how to tilt a man's perception by giving him only gentleness, never demanding anything in return. Their strategy lay not in action, but in withholding action. This form of influence was subtle, but its effects were profound. Over time, a man began to associate peace with the mistress, even though she carried none of the burdens that created unrest. He began to associate conflict with his wife, even though she was the only one attempting to maintain the structure of their life. Silence became a way to guide his emotions without ever touching the truth. The wife sensed this distortion, but could do little to counter it. Silence, when she used it, appeared cold or resentful. Words, when she used them, appeared harsh or demanding. She fought in a landscape where every choice worked against her. Her attempts to retain dignity made her seem rigid. Her attempts to express pain made her seem volatile. Her attempts to save the marriage made her seem desperate. Meanwhile, the mistress simply remained quiet and reaped the benefits. Strategic silence also allowed the mistress to survive shifts in favor. If the husband grew distant, she did not protest. If he grew uncertain, she did not question. If he grew restless, she did not cling. Her lack of reaction allowed him to interpret her however he wished. For women with no legal power and no rightful claim to their lovers, this form of protection was not only shrewd but necessary. Yet this strategy, however effective, deepened the wife's isolation. She watched as her efforts were overshadowed by another woman's passivity. She watched as her truth was dismissed, while another woman's silence was praised as virtue. She watched the emotional landscape of her marriage tilt further away from her with each quiet moment she did not control. In the end, the mistress's silence reshaped the household more powerfully than any spoken argument. It drew sympathy, shaped perceptions, and created illusions that the wife could never fully counter. It allowed the mistress to hold her place in a man's heart without ever fighting openly for it, and it forced the wife to battle not only betrayal, but the quiet, persistent influence of someone who understood exactly when not to speak. This silent strategy placed the wife in a struggle she could not escape, forcing her to argue against perceptions built from emptiness. The contrast between necessary words and deliberate quietness hardened impressions that neither truth nor effort could undo. Emerging beneath these shifting dynamics was a tension shaped by how silence itself could be turned into a form of emotional survival. Affection inside a Tudor household often split itself into two distinct shapes, each one formed not by the women involved, but by the positions they were forced to occupy. The mistress became the embodiment of softness, an imagined world of lightness, mystery, and ease. She represented the part of a man's desires, untouched by responsibility. Meanwhile, the wife became the face of duty. Her love was tied to labor, survival, stability, and the unglamorous tasks upon which a household depended. Men, conditioned by comfort, gravitated toward the gentler image, forgetting that gentleness existed only because someone else carried the weight. For the mistress, love unfolded in curated moments. She appeared when the day had already softened, when the house was quiet, when tensions had been swept aside by someone else's hands. She knew how to tilt her head just enough to appear thoughtful, how to let silence stretch until it felt tender, how to offer touch only when it demanded nothing in return. Her presence lived in the realm of longing, not endurance. She became a refuge precisely because she was not part of the world that required structure and sacrifice. The wife's reality was the opposite. Her affection showed itself in the invisible tasks that shaped daily life, preparing for guests, smoothing conflicts among servants, balancing accounts, and ensuring the family's stability. These acts of endurance rarely looked like romance. They looked like an obligation. A man saw the outcome of her efforts, but not the quiet exhaustion beneath them. Her love had weight, and because it had weight, it lacked the effortless glow of fantasy. This contrast deepened with each passing day. The mistress seemed to offer emotional freedom, though this freedom came only from her detachment from responsibility. She shared no burdens, solved no crises, and carried no consequences. The wife offered truth, often hard, sometimes unwelcomed, but truth that kept the household from collapsing under its own demands. As a result, the mistress's affection felt light, and the wife's affection felt heavy. Men interpreted this imbalance not as situational, but as personal. They believed the mistress was gentle because of her nature, and the wife was demanding because of hers. They forgot that gentleness born from a life of exemption is not the same as gentleness born from resilience. They forgot that a woman's ability to ask for nothing comes only when she is not expected to maintain anything. They forgot that the wife's questions and reminders were not weapons but lifelines. This perception shaped desire. The mistress became a symbol of warmth and escape, the place where a man could shed responsibility and bask in the illusion of simplicity. The wife became the place where he encountered his own shortcomings. Her intelligence reminded him of his failures. Her expectations reminded him of promises broken. Her presence demanded that he face the truth of himself. In this way, she became more burden than companion in his eyes, though he depended on her far more than he realized. Meanwhile, the mistress thrived in the absence of expectation. She did not have to worry about reputation, lineage, alliance, or household management. She floated through the edges of life with a softness created by circumstance. She could remain a mystery because she never had to reveal the parts of herself required for survival. Men mistook this mystery for depth. The wife, by contrast, had no space for mystery. Her life was exposed, evaluated, and judged. She had to be practical, organized, and efficient. She had to make decisions, mediate disputes, and uphold appearances. A mysterious wife was considered unreliable. A mysterious mistress was considered enchanting. The double standard became a wall she could not climb. This divergence created a quiet cruelty. Men expected their wives to be as comforting as mistresses, and their mistresses to be as loyal as wives. Neither expectation reflected reality. One woman was burdened by duty, the other survived by illusion. Yet the man's preference often shifted toward whichever demanded less effort from him. In this imbalance, affections ceased to be shared, work. It became a comparison played out against two separate landscapes. One, shaped by the weight of necessity. The other, shaped by the absence of it. The wife found herself judged for being too real, while the mistress was rewarded for remaining unreal. This left the wife in a perpetual state of inadequacy. No matter how deeply she loved, the tragedy lay in how predictably men drifted toward the lighter version of love. They believed the mistress represented who they truly were, when in truth she represented who they wished to be, unburdened, admired, never confronted. The wife represented the reality they tried to avoid, flawed, complicated, and full of consequences. A man chose escape, not because it offered truth, but because it demanded nothing. This contrast between softness and duty shaped his desires long before he understood the cost. The weight the wife carried made her love visible, while the mistress's distance made her love imagined. From this widening divide rose an even sharper conflict, as men began using silence itself to measure devotion. Comparison slipped easily into a Tudor marriage, often disguised as confusion rather than cruelty. A man, confronted by a wife's rightful concerns, found himself recoiling from the weight of her honesty. It was far easier for him to look toward the mistress, quiet, compliant, untouched by responsibility, and use her silence as a standard against which the wife inevitably failed. "She never complains as you do," he would say, believing the words to be simple observation, though they carried the sting of accusation. Silence became a measuring stick, and the wife was punished each time she dared to speak. The mistress's stillness made her seem endlessly tolerant. She did not question his choices, so he imagined her supportive. She did not express frustration, so he imagined her content. She did not name his faults, so he imagined she saw none. Her silence allowed him to believe he was a better man in her presence. He mistook emotional absence for emotional loyalty, not realizing how much of that gentle quietness existed because she bore no share of the burdens that shaped the wife's days. Meanwhile, the wife's words, each forged from responsibility, became evidence of supposed inadequacy. When she raised concerns about finances, he called her anxious. When she mentioned the mistress, he called her jealous. When she sought fairness, he called her demanding. Her honesty, which once anchored the family, transformed in his mind into the very reason the marriage felt strained. He used the mistress as a mirror to highlight the wife's perceived flaws, never questioning why only one of them had a life filled with consequences. This comparison deepened the wife's isolation. She began to doubt whether her concerns were valid, even when they emerged from genuine harm. She replayed conversations in her mind, wondering if she had sounded harsher than she intended. Meanwhile, the mistress had to do nothing at all. Her silence wrote a story for her, a story men preferred over reality. The wife lived under constant scrutiny, while the mistress floated above it. The cruelest part was how effortlessly men weaponized that silence. When the wife tried to explain her fatigue, he responded with, "She never seems overwhelmed." When the wife asked for respect, he replied, "She never asks for anything." When the wife expressed pain, he said, "She never makes me feel guilty." In this way, the mistress became an unspoken standard of goodness, even though her goodness was merely the absence of obligation. The household absorbed these comparisons as truth. Servants whispered that the mistress seemed more gentle. Visitors noted that she appeared more agreeable. Even friends of the family sometimes implied that the wife's temperament required attention. They did not see the unseen labor that shaped her tone, nor the subtle strategy behind the mistress's stillness. They judged based on surfaces, and surfaces favored the woman who risked nothing. Men, too, leaned deeper into the illusion. When confronted with conflict, they retreated into the fantasy the mistress represented. She made him feel unchallenged, unexamined, unburdened. Her silence wrapped him in a false sense of righteousness. He began to believe that the wife's voice was the source of marital strain, rather than the reflection of his own actions. In this way, he used the mistress not only as comfort, but as evidence. Evidence against the woman legally and emotionally bound to him. Over time, the wife learned she could not win comparisons built from myth, even if she softened her voice, even if she held back her frustrations. She could not compete with someone who had no responsibilities and therefore no opportunities to disappoint. A mistress's silence was not virtue, yet it appeared to be. A wife's truth was not cruelty, yet it sounded like it. She fought against an image rather than a person. An image shaped by the man's desire for ease. This dynamic eroded the emotional architecture of the marriage. Each accusation based on silence created a small fracture, a trust weakened, a bond stretched thin, a resentment left unattended. The more he held up the mistress as an ideal, the more he distanced himself from the reality of his home. The wife, trapped between duty and dismissal, found herself carrying not only the household but the weight of his comparisons. The mistress might not have intended harm, but intention mattered little. Her silence became a tool others used to judge the wife. Her absence of conflict made the wife's necessary concerns appear exaggerated. Her lack of participation made the wife's responsibilities appear flawed. And as long as men preferred the comfort of illusions, the wife's voice, steady, honest, essential, stood no chance against a silence that could not be challenged. By the time the husband realized the damage, the distance between him and his wife had already thickened. He mistook this distance for proof that the mistress understood him better. In truth, she simply required less of him. Comparison replaced companionship, and the marriage weakened beneath its weight. This quiet distortion allowed a man to rewrite blame using someone else's stillness as proof. The wife's truth lost ground each time he reached for the easier image instead of the harder reality. From this widening rift emerged a deeper threat, the way absence itself could be mistaken for devotion. Silence, when wielded by a mistress, often concealed a far more deliberate rhythm than anyone cared to admit. She understood that withdrawing at the right moment created tension more potent than any confession. A quiet disappearance unsettled a man in ways open confrontation never could. He wondered where she was, who she was with, whether she was hurt, or whether she was simply tired of him. His imagination did the work she never needed to voice. Distance became a lure, crafted with precision. She learned to retreat, not because she lacked affection, but because absence sharpened desire. A sudden stillness after a moment of warmth, a missed meeting, a letter left unanswered. Each choice created a subtle discomfort in him. He found himself leaning toward her without realizing she had stepped away. Her silence suggested mystery, vulnerability, and perhaps even disappointment. It let him believe he needed to chase her, that he had somehow failed her. Though nothing had been said, the wife had no such weapon. She could not disappear. Even when she longed to, her presence was required at meals, at gatherings, and in the management of household affairs. She could not step back to create intrigue. She could not withdraw to invite longing. Every absence would be interpreted as neglect of duty, coldness toward her husband, or incompetence in her role. She lived in a world where constancy was mandatory, and constancy, in a man's eyes, often became invisible because the wife was always there. Her presence lost its edge. Every effort she made, every meal arranged, every crisis managed, every detail remembered, blurred into routine. Familiarity swallowed appreciation. She became the structure of his life, solid and dependable, but rarely noticed. Meanwhile, the mistress's sporadic appearances allowed her to be seen each time as something new, something delicate, something worth pursuit. The mistress understood the power of timing. She stepped away only when she sensed his attention drifting, creating just enough uncertainty to pull him back. She did not abandon him. She simply paused long enough for longing to gather. Her restraint painted her as gentle rather than manipulative. Her silence made her seem like someone who felt deeply but spoke rarely. She let him imagine the depth of her emotions because she offered nothing to contradict his narrative. The wife, confronted with this carefully crafted absence, found herself at a disadvantage she could not address. When she attempted to discuss the mistress's manipulations, he called her paranoid. When she tried to highlight the emotional games being played, he insisted she was overthinking. He interpreted the mistress's withdrawals as signs of hurt or modesty, never strategy. He believed the wife's warnings came from jealousy, not accuracy. Within the household, these patterns grew sharper. Servants noticed when the mistress stopped visiting, whispering that she must have been mistreated. They never considered that the retreat was calculated. Visitors observed the wife's constant presence and misread it as rigidity. While the mistress's absence seemed like dignity, the narrative favored whoever spoke least, whoever revealed least, whoever risked least. The husband, too, fell deeper into this illusion. When the mistress pulled away, he felt a stirring fear of losing her, an emotion he interpreted as love. When the wife stood before him, steady and dependable, he felt no fear at all, and mistook that lack of fear for lack of desire. He could not understand that longing only grows where presence is uncertain. Stability cannot compete with mystery in the mind of a man searching for escape. The mistress's calculated withdrawal also protected her from consequence. By stepping away, she avoided conflict, avoided accountability, and avoided the increasing emotional demands that came when a relationship deepened. She retained the upper hand simply by refusing to be available at all times. In this way, her silence allowed her to maintain control without ever appearing dominant. The wife, meanwhile, faced the accumulating cost of constant availability. She absorbed his moods, bore his frustrations, and managed his disappointments. She endured the emotional weight the mistress avoided, and because she remained present, he took her presence for granted. He compared her steadiness to the mistress's fleeting softness, forgetting that love grounded in responsibility will always feel heavier than love grounded in illusion. In this imbalance, the mistress's absence became a question, one that echoed quietly in his thoughts. Where was she? Why had she not written? Was she angry? Was she heartbroken? Did she no longer care for him? The wife could never inspire these questions, not because she lacked worth, but because she could not manipulate presence. Her constancy muted the urgency of his emotions, while the mistress's retreat stirred them. Strategic silence became a rhythm that shaped the household. It created tension, fostered pursuit, and built an emotional architecture where the mistress seemed fragile, and the wife seemed unyielding. It was not the truth, but performance, not devotion, but timing, not love, but influence. And men, eager for simplicity, accepted the illusion with ease. This quiet choreography allowed absence to masquerade as depth, reshaping a man's desire through uncertainty. The wife's steadfast presence faded into routine, while the mistress's retreat created longing that felt profound. What rose between these shifting emotions was a deeper imbalance, where silence began to determine who held influence. Silence, when allowed to linger long enough, begins to take on a shape of its own. In the hands of a mistress, it became something more than mere absence of speech. It became a form of power that did not need to announce itself. The fewer words she offered, the more room she created for a man to imagine the depths behind them. Her silence wrapped her in a haze of mystery, turning her into someone he could never fully grasp. And the harder she was to grasp, the more he believed she must possess something rare. Men in Tudor households were often drawn toward whatever resisted easy understanding. They mistook opacity for depth and restraint for virtue. A mistress who revealed little seemed to possess quiet wisdom. A mistress who held back tears seemed strong. A mistress who spoke softly seemed compassionate. She controlled nothing directly, yet her very elusiveness pulled him toward her. He felt compelled to interpret her silence, to explain her moods, to guess her desires. In that guessing, he became invested. The wife, meanwhile, lived under the opposite expectation. She could not afford mystery. Her life required clarity, clear decisions, clear instructions, and clear communication. Ambiguity created disorder in a household that depended on her. Servants needed answers, children needed boundaries, and finances needed precision. A wife who remained vague was seen as incompetent. A wife who remained silent was seen as resentful. She was forced into transparency at every turn, while the mistress gained power precisely because she was not. This imbalance shaped everything. The more a mistress hid, the more he leaned toward her. The more a wife revealed, the more he pulled away. He never questioned why one woman was free to be enigmatic, while the other was bound to practicality. He never saw that the wife's supposed predictability was the outcome of responsibility, not lack of depth. Her clarity was not a void but a requirement, a necessity mistaken for dullness. As he drifted toward the mistress, he began to romanticize the unknown. Her silence became a canvas on which he painted whatever qualities he wished her to possess. If he wanted understanding, he imagined she understood him deeply. If he wanted gentleness, he imagined her heart was soft. If he wanted loyalty, he believed she waited for him silently. None of these qualities had to be true. They only needed to go unchallenged. Silence made that easy. The wife, in contrast, had no such protection. Her emotions were visible. Her fears had to be spoken. Her frustrations could not be hidden behind lowered lashes. She had to confront problems rather than wait for them to disappear. And in doing so, she lost the allure that comes from being unknowable. She could not offer mystery because she was forced to offer answers. She could not cultivate distance because she was responsible for closeness. Her transparency, once a strength, became a liability. Slowly, the mistress's silence hardened into something sharper than passivity. It became a way to control the emotional pace of the relationship. If she withdrew, he followed. If she softened, he melted. If she remained unreadable, he strained to interpret her. She did not command him, yet he adjusted himself around her stillness. Her silence shaped his behavior with a precision no spoken demand could achieve. The wife, watching from the confines of her duty, felt the shift before anyone named it. She noticed how often he wondered aloud about the mistress's thoughts, how gently he speculated about her inner world, how readily he forgave her quiet retreats. She saw how much energy he invested in understanding a woman who revealed nothing, while offering little effort to understand the woman who revealed everything. Within the household, silence became a kind of currency. The mistress used it to gain space, sympathy, and power over his imagination. The wife spent hers cautiously, knowing it would be interpreted as displeasure if used too often. The same gesture, quiet, held opposite meanings depending on who used it. For the mistress, it was a lure. For the wife, it was an accusation. And so the imbalance grew. The mistress held influence not through words or actions, but through the tension she created by withholding both. The wife struggled to maintain stability, while being judged for the very visibility her role required. A man standing between them gravitated toward the quiet mystery rather than the truth. It was a strange kind of power, one built from the space between words rather than the words themselves. But it worked because men believed that whatever they could not control must be precious. In their eagerness to grasp the unknown, they ignored the strength of the woman who held their world together. This delicate imbalance allowed silence to reshape affection without a single spoken demand. The wife's clarity became a burden, while the mistress's quietness became a lure no logic could undo. Rising beneath this tension was a new complication: how silence could punish as effectively as any spoken accusation. Letters in Tudor England carried more than ink. They carried expectation, longing, apology, and fear. A man who wrote to his mistress often imagined that each message revealed a piece of his heart, and he waited for her reply, as though it would confirm his place in hers. But she learned early that not answering was sometimes more powerful than responding. Silence on the page made him restless. A folded sheet left unanswered turned into a kind of possession. By withholding words, she shaped the rhythm of his desire without ever lifting her hand. He would sit by candlelight, reading the letter he had sent, imagining how she must have felt when she received it. Softened, surprised, touched. He imagined her hesitation as she held the quill, imagined the sigh she might have given while thinking of him. In truth, the letter may have remained unopened for hours, perhaps days, but he filled the silence with fantasy. The unanswered space allowed him to believe the bond between them was deeper than it truly was. Each day, without a reply, intensified his feelings. Concern shifted into yearning, yearning into anxiety, anxiety into the sweet ache of pursuit. He leaned toward her in thought because she kept herself just out of reach. Silence worked on him slowly, like a tide pulling him toward shore. He believed he had discovered himself. He mistook the ache for love, unaware that she crafted it by offering him nothing to hold. The wife, by contrast, had no such luxury. She was expected to answer every question, to respond to every call, and address every concern. When her husband demanded an explanation, she had to provide it. When he insisted on a discussion, she had to sit with him. She could not withhold her voice without inviting suspicion or conflict. She lived under the requirement of constant availability, while the mistress thrived on selective absence. Meetings between a man and his mistress followed the same pattern. She rarely committed to specific times. She let him wonder when she might appear, or whether she would appear at all. A missed rendezvous stirred guilt in him. Perhaps he had said something wrong. Perhaps he had not shown enough devotion. She did not need to accuse him. His own doubts did the work. Her unpredictability made every moment she granted him feel precious. The wife, meanwhile, was predictable because she had to be. Meals occurred at set times. Responsibilities dictated her movements. She could not create suspense without neglecting her duties. A missed meeting with her husband would be interpreted as disrespect. Silence from her would be taken as defiance. The very structure of the marriage prevented her from using the tools that gave the mistress such quiet control. This discrepancy created a strange emotional economy. The mistress offered scarcity, and scarcity increased value. The wife offered consistency, and consistency bred indifference. He believed the mistress cherished him more because she allowed him to chase her, though her distance required no sacrifice. He believed his wife cared less because she stopped him from drifting, though her presence demanded constant labor. The unanswered letter became a kind of stage. The mistress performed absence, and he performed longing, even if she had nothing to say. Her silence appeared meaningful because it allowed him to assign meaning himself. He imagined heartbreak, modesty, timidity, or deep emotional turmoil. He imagined everything except the possibility that she simply understood how desire sharpened in the void she created. The wife, observing these exchanges from the edges, felt the quiet cost long before anyone spoke it aloud. She noticed how often he checked the front hall for deliveries, how carefully he unfolded every scrap of parchment, how tense he grew when nothing arrived. She watched him replay each missed meeting in his mind, interpreting her rival's unpredictability as fragility rather than strategy. She realized that she could never compete with someone who controlled expectation through absence while she was confined to presence. Meanwhile, the mistress learned that silence also protected her from missteps. A written reply could be misread, but an unanswered letter created no contradictions. A scheduled meeting could reveal too much, but a cancelled one allowed her to maintain distance. She avoided entanglement by refusing to engage fully. In this refusal, she preserved her image while deepening his emotional dependence. The wife could only respond with truth, and truth rarely held the allure of imagination. She spoke plainly because she had to. She answered directly because evasion carried consequences. Her reliability, so essential to the household, became the very reason he overlooked her. She was always there, and in his mind, whatever was constant could not be as precious as whatever seemed uncertain. In time, the pattern solidified into expectation. He waited eagerly for the mistress's rare messages, interpreting each one as a gift. He grew irritated when his wife sought conversation, viewing her need for communication as an intrusion. Silence had become a language he preferred, because he could shape it into whatever comfort he desired. This quiet manipulation transformed unanswered moments into chains that held him fast. The wife's forced clarity stood in painful contrast to the mystery he willingly pursued. Growing beneath these intertwined silences was another fracture: how the freedom to withhold became its own form of advantage. Responsibility shaped the wife's life long before anyone spoke of love. She could not choose when to be present, when to be tender, or when to step away. Her affection had to exist whether she was tired or resentful, hopeful or hurt. She tended to the household regardless of mood. She endured long days of labor that no one acknowledged. And when night came, she was expected to offer warmth because marriage required it. Duty wove itself through her every gesture, her every breath, even love. For her was a form of work. The mistress lived in a different world, one built not from obligation but from choice. She appeared only when she felt like appearing. She offered affection only when she had the emotional space to do so. When she was weary, she retreated without explanation. When she felt uncertain, she disappeared for days. Her absence created no scandal. Her silence carried no consequence. She had the freedom to ration her presence in ways the wife never could. This freedom made her seem precious. A man interpreted her selective affection as depth. Each glimpse of her tenderness felt rare, and rarity made it valuable. He believed she offered her best self because she wanted to, not because she was required to. He mistook her moments of warmth as proof of devotion, forgetting that she could preserve those moments precisely by avoiding the daily burdens that eroded the wife's strength. The wife's constancy, by contrast, became invisible. She was expected to absorb conflict without wavering and provide stability even when she received none in return. Her affection blurred into routine because she could not choose when to give it. She could not step away to protect herself. She could not delay love until she felt ready. Marriage demanded she remain emotionally available even when she felt emptied. This imbalance deepened with time. When the mistress withdrew, he longed for her. When the wife remained, he barely noticed her presence. The very reliability that held the household together became the reason he undervalued her. The mistress's unpredictability made her intriguing, The wife's predictability made her seem dull. He did not recognize that one woman offered everything because she had to, while the other offered almost nothing because she was allowed to. Freedom also gave the mistress power. She shaped the emotional tone of the relationship simply by deciding whether to appear or not. If she felt overlooked, she vanished for a while. If she wanted attention, she returned with soft eyes and a half-whispered apology. Her selective presence trained him to anticipate her moods and chase her favors. She never needed to ask for devotion. Scarcity created it naturally. The wife, trapped in constancy, could not evoke the same pull. If she withdrew, he called her cold. If she expressed exhaustion, he called her ungrateful. If she hesitated, he accused her of losing affection. She lived under scrutiny that punished her for any deviation from expectation. Her love had to be steady, and steady love was easy to take for granted. Servants noticed the difference. They whispered that the mistress seemed gentler, though they saw her only in curated moments. Never during hardship. Never during conflict. They failed to understand that gentleness is effortless when one is not carrying the weight of a household. They judged the wife by her exhaustion, mistaking duty for harshness and endurance for lack of charm. The husband, too, drifted into this illusion. He sought the mistress when he wanted ease, and the wife when he needed structure. He ignored how unequal the exchange truly was. The wife carried the emotional labor of the marriage, absorbing his anger, managing his expectations, tending to his vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, the mistress carried nothing. Her freedom to pick and choose made her seem more loving, not less, because he experienced her only in moments she had polished for his eyes. In the quiet spaces of the home, the wife felt this imbalance with a heaviness she could not speak aloud. She watched him return from secret meetings, looking softened by the illusion of gentle affection. She listened to his excuses when the mistress cancelled gatherings or withheld replies. She saw how his frustration with her own obligations grew each time he compared her responsibility to another woman's freedom. The tragedy was not merely that he misread the women's roles. It was that he believed freedom made love purer. He did not understand that real devotion often looks like endurance, not fantasy. He mistook the mistress's choices for sincerity and the wife's obligations for emotional insufficiency. He saw desire where there was only avoidance, and dissatisfaction where there was only duty. In this imbalance, longing grew toward the one who offered little, while resentment grew toward the one who offered everything. Each interaction widened the gap between fantasy and reality. The wife remained tethered to the life they built. The mistress drifted on her own terms, untouchable and therefore irresistible. This widening contrast made choice appear like devotion and duty appear like a burden. The wife's steady presence faded in his mind, while the mistress's selective warmth sharpened into allure. From this shifting dynamic arose another shadow, how freedom itself could be mistaken for love. Silence became a kind of shield, long before anyone realized it could also be a blade. A mistress learned early that words were dangerous in a world where every sentence could be twisted, repeated, or weaponized. She understood that speaking made her vulnerable, not because she had anything shameful to confess, but because her voice existed outside the legitimacy granted to the wife. One misplaced phrase could paint her as manipulative. One honest fear could mark her as clingy. One small opinion could be reshaped into evidence of ambition. So she learned to close her mouth and let the world imagine her gentleness. This restraint gave her a power few expected. Men believed her silence meant she was agreeable. Servants assumed it meant humility. Even the wife, watching her from across a corridor, mistook it for innocence. They all saw what they wanted to see, which was precisely why silence worked. It allowed her to slip between intentions, to exist without accusation, to offer no material for judgment. She became a figure people projected their own desires onto, untarnished by the inconvenience of personality. Meanwhile, the wife had no such refuge. Her words were demanded. not requested. She had to speak to defend the household, to correct servants, to address finances, to steady her husband's reputation, to answer questions whose consequences fell solely upon her shoulders. Every word she said was weighed, measured, dissected. She lived in an environment where silence from her would be interpreted not as virtue but as negligence or rebellion. The same stillness that protected the mistress would condemn the wife. The mistress understood this contrast well. She saw how the wife's words, spoken out of responsibility, were twisted into signs of irritability. She noticed how the wife's concerns were dismissed as emotional excess. She realized that by holding her tongue, she created a comparison that worked in her favor. Each moment of speech from the wife became another opportunity for judgment, while each moment of silence from her became another mark of grace. But silence also served another purpose. It kept her safe. In a household where she did not belong by right, where her presence depended on the shifting moods of a man, where her future teetered on precarious affection, speaking was a risk she could not afford. Any misstep could expel her. Any rumored comment could ruin her. Silence protected her from the consequences of being misinterpreted. Her quiet became a mask she put on each time she entered a room. Behind it, she hid her anxieties, her ambitions, her anger, her longing. She learned to breathe slowly, to lower her gaze just enough to appear soft, to let moments pass without response. In doing so, she remained unthreatening, a shadow gliding through private spaces without leaving traces for others to examine. Men misread this entirely. They saw mystery where she felt fear. They saw gentleness where she held herself rigid. They believed her silence meant she trusted them, admired them, adored them. They did not understand it was simply the safest way to exist near them. She allowed their misunderstandings to stand, because those misunderstandings kept her protected. Silence softened her edges. It made her seem less flawed. It erased the parts of her that might expose her humanity. And because she never defended herself verbally, people assumed she had nothing to defend. Her quiet became synonymous with purity, patience, goodness, virtues she did not necessarily possess, but which silence conveniently suggested. The wife, watching all this unfold, felt the cruelty of the situation with a clarity that burned. She knew the mistress wasn't truly gentle. She simply wasn't forced into situations where her limits showed. She knew silence could be strategic, but she also knew she herself would be punished for employing it. She could not retreat into quiet without being labelled cold. She could not protect herself without being called indifferent. In contrast, every silent moment the mistress offered became another reason men praised her. Over time, silence turned the mistress into an idea rather than a person. Men filled that space with fantasies of understanding and harmony. They projected onto her the qualities they wished the wife had, forgetting that the wife's every action carried the burden of duty. Silence allowed the mistress to remain untouched by reality. Yet beneath this carefully curated stillness, the mistress carried private fears. She knew her position depended not on loyalty or affection, but on the fragile illusion she crafted. She knew that if she ever spoke too honestly, the illusion might crack. She knew that silence kept her safe, but also isolated. She lived behind a mask she could never remove, because dropping it might expose the vulnerability she worked so hard to conceal. This fragile mask protected her from judgment while placing the wife under sharper scrutiny. Each quiet moment allowed her to drift above consequence, while the wife drowned beneath expectation. Behind that, faint, deliberate stillness waited a truth neither woman could escape. How silence could twist an entire household's loyalties. A single spoken sentence could shatter a woman's standing, yet an entire silence could elevate another. That imbalance shaped daily life inside Tudor households in ways both cruel and predictable. A wife learned quickly that every word she uttered moved under scrutiny, whether she was correcting a servant, expressing fatigue, or naming an injustice she could no longer bear. Her voice, bound to obligation. I became a source of suspicion the moment it escaped her lips. People listened not to understand her, but to assess her. They waited for signs of impatience, signs of pride, signs of weakness. Almost anything could be interpreted as too sharp, too emotional, or too bold. Meanwhile, the mistress lived inside a quieter world. Her silence was not judged, it was praised. The absence of complaint became virtue. Her muted presence was labelled softness. The way she lowered her eyes when spoken to was taken as proof of gentleness rather than calculation. Society rewarded her stillness because it demanded nothing from her. She had no duty to speak on behalf of a household, no responsibility to manage finances or uphold lineage. Her silence cost her nothing and gained her everything. Men helped reinforce this imbalance without realizing they were doing it. They complained that the wife talked too much, even when she said only what was necessary. They marveled that the mistress never raised her voice, never questioned them, never brought worries to their attention. They failed to see that she remained quiet because she had the luxury of doing so. They mistook freedom from responsibility for superiority of character. The wife sensed this unfairness each time she entered a room filled with whispers and expectations. She knew that speaking honestly exposed her to judgment, but staying silent invited accusations of coldness. There was no winning. Her voice was demanded, then punished. She carried the double burden of having to speak and being condemned for speaking. The mistress, on the other hand, wielded silence like silk armor. She could imply devotion without promising it. She could appear humble without sacrificing dignity. She could let men believe she was peaceful and untroubled simply because she withheld anything that might contradict that illusion. Silence let her become whatever others wished her to be. The household interpreted this quiet through a lens shaped by fantasy rather than truth. Servants said she had a soft temperament. Men praised her modesty. Even other women, though resentful, sometimes wondered how she managed to appear so serene. None recognized that serenity was nothing more than the absence of responsibility. Silence kept her untouchable, while the wife's unavoidable words made her vulnerable. In social circles, this contrast became even sharper. A wife who spoke with firmness at a gathering could be labelled arrogant. A mistress who said nothing at all was deemed elegant. A wife who voiced concern for her children was called anxious. A mistress who stayed quiet about everything was admired for her composure. The world preferred a woman who floated through conversations like mist over one who carried the weight of duty. Silence itself became a kind of currency, one that the mistress spent generously. Knowing how valuable it appeared, she could wait for long pauses to settle in the air, letting men fill them with assumptions. They imagined she was agreeable, loyal, and patient. They imagined she possessed a depth the wife supposedly lacked. Silence created a canvas onto which they painted their desires. The wife, watching this unfold, felt an ache she could never quite voice. She knew she was judged by what she said, yet expected to carry everything unsaid. She lived inside contradictions that would have broken a weaker woman. Her truth came with consequences. Her honesty came with penalties. Her words, necessary though they were, became stumbling stones. And still, she had to speak. For children, for the estate, for appearances, for her husband's reputation, for the smooth functioning of a world that relied on her labour but resented the sound of her voice. The mistress, knowing this contrast perfectly, used it without ever appearing to use anything. She didn't need to accuse the wife of being difficult. The wife's responsibilities already made her appear so. She didn't need to present herself as virtuous. Silence did that for her. She didn't need to win arguments. She only needed to avoid them. Every quiet moment became a silent declaration of superiority. What society never admitted was this: silence was only considered beautiful when it came from a woman who had nothing to risk. A wife's silence was negligence. A mistress's silence was virtue. A wife's voice was unrest. A mistress's quiet was grace. The contrast between punished speech and celebrated silence revealed how easily a woman's voice could be turned against her. The mistress understood this imbalance and stepped into it with careful quietness that reshaped how others judged her. Beneath that cultivated stillness lay a power shift that would soon press the wife into a corner she could not escape. The divide between the wife and the mistress did not need raised voices or visible conflict to deepen. It grew quietly in the spaces where judgment settled before truth had the chance to breathe. In Tudor households, where every gesture could be recorded and replayed through gossip, a woman's reputation depended not on what she did, but on what others believed she was capable of. The wife, bound to duty and expected to guard the family's honor, lived beneath a scrutiny so sharp it cut through intentions and left only suspicion behind. Her attempts to defend herself often sounded like excuses to those who had already decided she held too much feeling, too much urgency, too much reason to be doubted. A mere question, spoken with measured calm, could be labelled a motive. A tremor in her voice could be called jealousy. A request for fairness could be transformed into proof that she was impossible. Across the same rooms, the mistress needed no words to build a contrasting image. Her silence functioned like an open space, others filled with assumptions they found comforting. Because she remained outside the official structure of the household, she carried neither burdens nor expectations, only interpretations. People saw softness where there was simply quiet. They saw innocence where there was merely absence. Her lack of objection became a kind of halo. Even the moments when she lowered her eyes, whether from calculation or convenience, were read as humility. In a court culture trained to fear emotional discomfort, the mistress appeared easier to manage than the wife who dared to speak. And so the imbalance grew. When the wife voiced concern about finances, the mistress's stillness made her seem greedy. When the wife questioned her husband's late hours, the mistress's silence made her seem paranoid. When the wife asked for respect, the mistress's gentle composure made her appear demanding. The contrast was never fair. One woman judged for every syllable, the other praised for withholding them. The court and servants reinforced this distortion with sighs, whispers, and the occasional sympathetic glance toward the quieter woman who seemed never trouble anyone. They mistook the mistress's silence for virtue because they preferred a woman who asked for nothing. The husband, too, became entangled in the comparison he himself created. He allowed the mistress's quiet to soothe him, imagining purity where there was simply a lack of responsibility. He returned home, expecting his wife to match that passivity, forgetting that the wife was responsible for the estate, the lineage, and the very structure that supported his status. The mistress merely reacted. The wife was required to act. One carried the burden of the future, the other carried the illusion of freedom. This difference made the wife's effort appear exhausting, while the mistress's emptiness looked refreshing. The result was predictable, though rarely spoken aloud. In moments of conflict, people believed the woman who said nothing over the woman who spoke. The mistress was seen as guileless simply because she never offered evidence of complexity. The wife, by contrast, was treated as though every word she said contained a hidden agenda. Her clarity became confrontation. Her honesty became a strategy. Her pain became manipulation. She was a woman who could not win. If she stayed silent, she looked cold. If she spoke, she looked untrustworthy. Meanwhile, the mistress gained sympathy she never had to earn. Servants pitied her as the softer soul, imagining her caught in a romance beyond her control. Courtiers described her with words like gentle, delicate, unfortunate, though she lacked no comfort and knew precisely how her silence shaped perception. She became the injured party without suffering injury, the tender heart without revealing emotion. the innocent figure without proving innocence. The wife's losses accumulated quietly at first. She lost credibility. She lost the benefit of the doubt. She lost the assumption of goodness that had once belonged to her simply because she fulfilled her role. Eventually, in many households, she lost intimacy with her husband. His comfort had shifted toward the woman whose silence made him feel uncomplicated. His frustration settled on the woman whose responsibilities forced her to speak realities he preferred not to hear. Once the comparison hardened into habit, the wife stood alone in a narrative she did not shape, seen as difficult not because of her actions, but because the other woman demanded nothing. In the most unfortunate marriages, the shift went deeper. Some husbands believed the mistress's quiet more than the wife's truth. Some allowed rumors to cloud judgment. Some acted as though the mistress had been wronged whenever the wife simply asked for respect. And behind these distortions lay a single fact. The mistress did not need to prove anything to be believed, while the wife could prove everything and still be doubted. One lost her marriage piece by piece. The other gained compassion she did not necessarily deserve. The contrast between burden and freedom tilted public sympathy before either woman had spoken. The wife's truth dissolved beneath the gentleness others imagined into the mistress's silence. Rising within that imbalance was a new form of loyalty. One shaped not by honesty, but by yearning for the easiest woman to believe. There was a kind of quiet indulgence woven into the emotional habits of Tudor men. A softness not of the heart, but of expectation. They lived in a world that rarely demanded introspection from them, where discomfort could be avoided simply by turning toward the person who asked for the least. Emotional labor was considered a woman's duty, not theirs. All a man needed to do was choose the path that minimized friction. In this arrangement, the mistress, with her cultivated quietness, her carefully measured presence, her refusal to complicate anything, became an easy refuge. She did not confront him with household problems. She did not question decisions that affected her future. She did not remind him of responsibilities he preferred to ignore. Her silence allowed him to imagine himself understood without ever having to explain a feeling. The wife, on the other hand, was tied to the machinery of the household and the weight of lineage. She needed clarity from her husband because the estate demanded it. She needed commitment because children needed stability. She needed honesty because rumors could crush a family's reputation. Asking these things turned her into an anchor he resented dragging behind him. Every time she spoke of duty or fairness, he felt burdened. Every time she confronted an issue he had neglected, he felt criticized. This was not because her concerns were unreasonable, but because Tudor men were raised with the notion that their comfort was a sign of rightful authority. Emotional ease became a form of entitlement. In such a world, truth felt less appealing than obedience. A mistress who nodded gently, who offered listening without questioning, who stayed silent when his choices were selfish. She became the version of womanhood he wished the world would present to him everywhere. Her quietness reassured him that he was rational, even when he was not. Her lack of challenge allowed him to believe he was fair, even when he was unjust. She seemed to confirm every flattering thought he had about himself simply by failing to resist it. So he began to mistake this quietness for affection. He believed the mistress's compliance meant she understood him more deeply than his wife ever could. He convinced himself that love should feel effortless, as though the absence of disagreement meant harmony. In truth, he was simply evading the emotional work of seeing another person clearly. He preferred a relationship that never revealed his faults over one that required him to confront them. This emotional weakness grew into a pattern. When conflict arose with his wife, he retreated to the woman who asked nothing of him except his presence. When the wife pressed him for honesty, he hid behind the mistress's quietness. When the wife challenged his decisions, he found relief in the mistress's refusal to challenge anything at all. Slowly, he began to reinterpret his wife's truth as hostility, because truth was harder to face than flattery. A man who does not wish to think deeply will always prefer the person who spares him from thought. In taverns, courtyards, and hunting lodges, conversations among men reinforced this avoidance. They reassured each other that wives were dramatic, overly emotional, and too demanding. They spoke of mistresses as sweet, uncomplicated, grateful. The contrast had nothing to do with the women themselves. It reflected the men's unwillingness to meet their partners with maturity. A silent mistress was not easier because she loved more gently. She was easier because she allowed them to remain unexamined. And so silence became the supposed proof of love. If she did not protest, she must adore him. If she did not question, she must trust him. If she did not express needs, she must be selfless. This illusion was convenient, allowing him to believe he inspired devotion simply by existing. The wife, meanwhile, who expressed concern or asked for emotional reciprocity, was painted as the one who loved poorly. She felt more deeply and was punished for it. He felt less and was rewarded. This emotional laziness had consequences beyond the household. It shaped laws that ignored women's voices, social norms that dismissed their experiences, and expectations that praised quietness as virtue. A man who never practiced emotional accountability at home had no reason to support it in the world beyond. And because silence made him feel safe, he mistook that safety for moral correctness. By the time the imbalance was clear, the damage had already settled into the marriage. The wife's words, shaped by necessity, were met with annoyance. The mistress's quiet, shaped by strategy, was interpreted as devotion. The man's preference became self-fulfilling. The more he fled from emotional work, the more he believed he had chosen wisely in avoiding it. In the shadows of Tudor halls, this pattern repeated so often that it hardened into cultural logic. The ease he found in quietness became a substitute for the intimacy he never learned to build. The wife's honesty dimmed beneath the glow he imagined in compliant silence. Waiting beneath this contrast was a truth he refused to face: how much harm a man could cause simply by choosing comfort over conscience. Silence, in the Tudor world, was not a gentle virtue as sermons liked to claim. It was a tool sharpened by necessity, carried most effectively by the women who knew their voices would change nothing. The mistress learned this quickly. She understood that any opinion she offered could be twisted into ambition, any concern into manipulation, any truth into insolence. But a woman who said nothing could not be accused of anything. Her stillness became a shield, a way to step through the corridors of the household without leaving footprints others could follow or condemn. In a society where a woman's worth was determined by how little noise she made, silence became her safest form of speech. The wife, however, lived in a different reality. She could not afford silence. She had responsibilities tied to the estate, the lineage, and the social standing of the family. She had to speak to correct mistakes, ensure order, and protect the future. Her voice carried weight, not because she desired authority, but because she was entrusted with it. Yet the more she fulfilled her duties, the more she was framed as demanding or difficult. The mistress's quiet created a contrast that punished the wife for doing precisely what her role required. Responsibility made her visible. Visibility made her vulnerable. This was the cruel paradox at the heart of Tudor marriage. The woman who carried the burden was judged more harshly than the woman who carried nothing. The mistress's silence appeared graceful because it was detached from obligation. Her quietness could be mistaken for virtue because she never had to voice the truths that strained the structure of the home. She could stand beside the wife like a soft reflection, gentler, or calmer, unburdened, and such a comparison was inherently unfair. The wife spoke because life demanded it of her. The mistress was silent because she could afford to be. Men, caught between these two forms of womanhood, often chose the easier presence. They mistook the mistress's quiet for peace and the wife's honesty for conflict. They convinced themselves that the one who stayed silent loved more deeply, when in truth, the silence was a survival instinct honed by centuries of social dismissal. Tudor men saw what they wanted to see: devotion in compliance, loyalty in passivity, affection in restraint. They placed meaning where there was strategic emptiness, and they overlooked sincerity in the very woman who fought hardest for the household's stability. Over time, this imbalance carved a deeper wound into the marriage. The wife found herself battling perceptions she did not create. Her words, shaped by necessity, were met with resistance. Her pleas for fairness were labelled emotional. Her efforts to protect the family were reframed as self-interest. Meanwhile, the mistress gained sympathy simply by not refuting anything. Her silence made her a vessel for projections of sweetness, innocence, fanned fragility. No woman could compete with an image built from imagination rather than reality. The mistress understood this power, even if she never named it. She learned when to step back so her absence could be misinterpreted as sorrow. She learned when to lower her gaze so observers would assume humility. She learned that a carefully timed stillness could reshape an entire narrative. Silence became a delicate thread she pulled to shift the balance without ever appearing to touch it. Each unspoken word became a subtle cut, a pressure applied not directly but through suggestion. Suggestion that the wife was harsher, colder, more unstable. For the wife, these cuts accumulated slowly, almost invisibly, until the marriage itself felt reshaped by shadows. She watched her husband drift toward the woman who demanded nothing, and away from the woman who held the structure together. She found her truth dismissed in favor of a quietness that never risked contradiction. She watched sympathy gather around the mistress like mist, soft and undeserved. And she learned, painfully, that in a world resistant to women's voices, silence could harm more effectively than accusation. Yet the most unsettling truth was that society preferred the mistress's method, the Tudor ideal of womanhood: obedient, patient, uncomplaining, fit neatly into the strategy of quiet manipulation. People praised the mistress for traits she did not possess, and condemned the wife for qualities she could not avoid. Silence succeeded not because it was noble, but because it aligned with a culture that feared outspoken women more than deceit. In this world, even morality bowed to convenience. By the time the wife realized she was fighting a battle she could not win, the outcome had already taken shape. She lost trust. She lost influence. In the worst cases, she lost her marriage. The mistress gained the kind of emotional power that made her appear fragile, while placing her at the center of decisions she never had to take responsibility for. Silence had created two opposing forms of femininity. One admired, one doubted, and the consequences shaped the lives of both women with ruthless clarity. And so the story ends where it began, with silence. Not as virtue, not as softness, but as strategy. The mistress used it because she had no other weapon. The wife suffered because her voice was the only defense she possessed. Between them stretched a social structure that rewarded the woman who disappeared and punished the one who stood her ground. The truth is simple and bleak. In Tudor England, a woman without power could wield silence more sharply than any accusation. It allowed her to shape perception without exposure, to influence without risk, to wound without being blamed. The wife may have held the household together, but the mistress held the narrative, and narratives, in the end, decide who is believed. So silence, once praised as a woman's virtue, revealed itself instead as a woman's battlefield, a place where the absence of sound spoke more loudly than any truth she might have dared to say, a place where the price of survival was invisibility, a place where the quietest woman cut the deepest. And now, as this tale closes, let the noise of Tudor halls fade. Let the shifting loyalties soften into distance. Let the women who bore the weight of these stories find the stillness they were never allowed to choose. Good night. Listener, may your rest be gentler than the lives of the women who walked those corridors of shadow and expectation. May the silence around you be a comfort, not a cage. And may sleep take you into a world where no woman must hide her voice to survive.